This is the story of Aaron, the brother of Moses, the first high priest of Israel, and a man who stood at the center of miracles, mountains, and mistakes. Through his journey, we learn that even great leaders must choose obedience over applause, and that the fear of people can lead even the strongest into sin. Aaron's life is a reminder that God calls us not just to lead, but to listen. It began under a sky the color of hammered bronze, where campfires crackled across the wide valley of Rephidim. Aaron sat close to the flames, stirring a pot of lentils while the sounds of the Hebrew camp settled into the hush of twilight. Children laughed faintly in the distance. Shepherds returned with flocks. And at the far edge of the valley, the silhouette of his younger brother, Moses, stood like a statue atop a ridge, alone with God. Miriam approached, brushing dust from her robes. "He's been gone a long time," she said. Aaron nodded. "Longer than usual." 40 days is more than long," she muttered. "People are restless." Aaron stirred the pot again, but didn't answer. Not yet. The fire popped and crackled, and in its glow, Aaron's eyes reflected something else, a memory long buried, a time before the wilderness, before the miracles, before Moses ever returned from Egypt, a time when Aaron had been nothing more than a Hebrew slave with calloused hands and a tired heart. Years earlier, in the city of On, Aaron had stood beside a mud brick wall listening as an Egyptian overseer shouted commands in a voice as sharp as a whip. Sweat poured down his face as he hauled stones into place and his back ached from the strain. "Faster!" the taskmaster roared. Aaron didn't respond. He just kept moving. That was life, day after day, stone after stone, lash after lash. And then one day, without warning, a rumor spread like fire in dry grass. Moses is back. Aaron had dropped his tools. He hadn't seen his younger brother since they were boys. Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's palace while Aaron labored in the mud. But now he was back, and he brought a message. "Let my people go." The next morning, Aaron met Moses by the Nile. The wind was still. The river glistened like melted silver. Moses looked different, older, rougher, eyes deeper than Aaron remembered. "I can't speak well," Moses had said, gripping his staff. "God said you'd speak for me." Aaron blinked. "Me?" Moses nodded. "You'll stand beside me. We'll do this together." And from that moment on, Aaron's life changed forever. Back at the campfire, Miriam's voice brought him back. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "They're asking for answers." Aaron looked at her, and though he didn't say it out loud, the thought was there. "I've been second my whole life, second to Pharaoh, second to Moses, second to God's voice. And now, they were all looking to him, waiting. The fire burned low as night swept over the valley. Aaron pulled his cloak tighter, staring into the glowing embers. He was no longer just Moses' brother. He was a leader now. But leadership, he would learn, doesn't always mean strength. Sometimes it's where weakness hides. The next morning came with tension in the air. Not the kind you could see, but the kind you could feel. It moved through the camp like heat before a storm, buzzing, sharp, alive. Murmurs had become questions. Questions had become whispers. And now, whispers were becoming shouts. "He's not coming back. Moses is dead." 40 days is long enough. Aaron stepped out of his tent and into a storm of voices. He barely had time to breathe before the people began surrounding him, dozens at first, then hundreds. Faces he recognized, neighbors, elders, craftsmen, mothers with tear-streaked cheeks, fathers gripping staffs, and behind their eyes, panic. A man with wild eyes stepped forward. We trusted him. He promised us a land flowing with milk and honey, and instead he climbed a mountain and disappeared. He led us into the middle of nowhere, someone else spat, and then he left us. We need something real, a young woman cried, clutching her child. Something we can see. Aaron raised both hands and stepped onto a nearby rock. Brothers, sisters, peace, he shouted. Moses is with the Lord. He will return in the Lord's time. But the people didn't want patience. They wanted proof. From the back of the crowd, a voice rang out. Then make us a God we can see? A ripple moved through the mass of people. Another voice joined. A God that walks before us. Yes, a leader we can touch. Aaron's heart thundered in his chest. This wasn't grief anymore. It was fear. And it was growing. Miriam pushed through the crowd and grabbed his arm. Aaron, she hissed, don't listen to them. I'm trying to hold them back, he whispered. You know the Lord, she said. You've seen what he can do. You know better. Aaron glanced at the faces around him, hopeful, angry, desperate. They'll riot, he said. Let them, Miriam replied, firm. Better to fear God than fear people. But Aaron hesitated, because he had always been the in-between. The smoother of conflict, the voice of calm, the one people trusted, and now they were looking at him not just for comfort, but for control. He turned back to the crowd. Bring me your gold, he said. Earrings, bracelets, necklaces, anything you have. There was a pause. Surprise flickered across their faces. Then, cheers. Hands flew to ears, to pockets, to packs. Children ran through the camp, gathering gold like treasure. Some praised Aaron for being bold. Some cried in relief. And Miriam stood frozen. What are you doing? She asked, stunned. Aaron didn't meet her eyes. I'm buying time. Time for what? For Moses. For God. For anything to stop this from exploding. Miriam's voice dropped to a whisper. You're not calming a fire, Aaron. You're feeding it. But Aaron had already turned away. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the gold came. Heaps of it, laid before him like tribute, a mountain of melted promises. Aaron stared at it for a long time. Then slowly, he reached for the tools. The fire roared. The metal hissed, and his hands, steady, skilled, began to shape it. A horn, a leg, a smooth, curved back, hammer, twist, weld. Miriam watched from a distance, silent, heartbroken. By midnight, it stood tall in the center of the camp, a golden calf, gleaming, cold, lifeless, and the people, they erupted. They danced, they sang, they clapped their hands and called it holy. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. Some fell on their knees, some threw rose petals, some poured wine in front of it, and Aaron stepped back, heart pounding like a drum in a deep cave. He hadn't meant for this. He hadn't wanted this. He just wanted to keep them from falling apart, but in trying to hold them together, he had led them away from the only one who could truly hold them up. That night, the camp didn't sleep. It shouted, it danced, it rejoiced, but it did not fear. There was fire in the camp, but none in their hearts. And somewhere, far above, lightning cracked against a silent sky. On the mountain, the Lord was already telling Moses what Aaron had done. The people had traded his glory for a statue, and the one chosen to stand before him had knelt before applause. The sky was still dark when the shouting stopped. The fires still burned. The golden calf still gleamed in the torchlight. But the music had faded into silence. A strange, uneasy quiet settled over the camp, like the air had run out of breath. Aaron sat alone near the idol, hands blackened from the fire, arms trembling. His robe smelled of smoke and sweat and something worse. Regret. He had built the calf to keep the peace, but now even peace felt poisoned. Somewhere above, a deep rumble rolled through the mountain peaks. It wasn't thunder. It was something heavier, something divine. On Mount Sinai, Moses stood in the presence of glory. His face was pale. His arms ached from holding the tablets of stone etched by God himself. But his heart was breaking. Because God had told him what Aaron had done, what the people had done. They have corrupted themselves, the Lord had said. They have turned aside quickly from my commands. They made a calf, Moses whispered, stunned. And they worshipped it, God said. They bowed to the work of their own hands. Then came the words that froze the mountain. Step aside, Moses. I will consume them and make a nation from you. Moses dropped to his knees. No, Lord, he cried. Please, don't destroy them. Blot me out first, but spare them. He wept as he prayed. Not just for the people, but for Aaron, his brother. By the time Moses descended the mountain, his hands were trembling, not from weakness but from fury. Each step cracked against stone. Each breath was heavy with grief. Joshua met him halfway. He had heard the shouting, the laughter, the music. It sounds like war, Joshua said. Moses kept walking. No, he said, it's worse. When the camp came into view, the scene unfolded like a nightmare. Dancers still twirled around the calf. Some slept near the altar, heads resting on wine jars. Children clapped and sang beside the golden idol as if it were a game. And in the center of it all, Aaron, worn, exhausted, silent. Moses didn't yell. He didn't shout. He walked straight to the calf, past the gasping crowd, past the stunned worshippers, and raised the stone tablets above his head. They flashed in the sunlight, holy words, divine commands, and came crashing down. The shattering echoed across the camp like thunder from heaven. Stone split against stone, the covenant broken. The people froze. No one dared speak. Moses turned to Aaron. His voice cracked like fire. What did they do to you, he demanded, that you led them into this sin? Aaron's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. They were afraid, he stammered. They thought you were gone. They asked for something they could follow. Moses stepped closer. You built them an idol. I asked for their gold, Aaron said, voice thin. I threw it into the fire and out came this calf. It was a weak lie. They both knew it. But Moses didn't scream. He didn't argue. He just stared. And that silence was worse than any rebuke. Aaron lowered his eyes. Moses turned, gathered the calf, and crushed it into powder. He burned it in the fire, ground it down until nothing of its shape remained. Then he poured it into the water and made the people drink it. The taste of their sin bitter on their tongues. Judgment followed. Moses stood at the gate of the camp and shouted, "Whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me." Only the Levites came. Swords were drawn. 3,000 men died that day, not for dancing, but for defiance, not for fear, but for hardened hearts. Aaron watched it all unfold. The blood, the silence, the ashes. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. Because in trying to avoid the people's anger, he had provoked God's, and that was far worse. That night, the camp sat in silence. No singing, no clapping, no dancing, only the weight of what had happened. Aaron sat outside his tent, face to the ground. He wasn't thinking about leadership or power or even forgiveness. He was thinking about the moment he chose peace over truth, the moment he chose approval over obedience, and the cost that came with it. Above, the mountain still glowed faintly, and somewhere in the cloud, God was watching. The morning after the golden calf was nothing like the day before. Gone were the songs and drums. Gone was the laughter. Only silence remained, thick and heavy, like a blanket of dust over the camp. Aaron sat outside his tent, staring at the ashes of what had been. Children passed by quietly, holding their mother's hands. Men didn't meet his eyes. Even Miriam, who usually spoke her mind like a sword, said nothing. Because there were no words for what had happened. Inside Moses' tent, the glow of the mountain still clung to his skin, but his face was worn. His voice rasped when he called for Aaron. Aaron didn't want to go. He didn't want to face the brother whose trust he had shattered, or the God he had betrayed. But he came. One slow step at a time. Inside, Moses didn't look up. He was bent over scrolls, writing, rewriting, crossing out lines with shaking hands. When Aaron finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." Moses didn't move. "I didn't know what else to do," Aaron added. "I tried to calm them. I thought if I could just hold them together until you came back." "You didn't hold them together," Moses snapped. "You broke them." Aaron flinched. "I was afraid," he admitted. "I thought if I said no, they'd turn on me. I thought I was protecting them." "No," Moses said again, this time looking up. His eyes were red, sharp. "You were protecting yourself." Aaron had no reply, only shame. That afternoon, Moses went back up the mountain, alone, no food, no water, just a shattered covenant and a desperate plea. Aaron watched him go from the edge of the camp, wondering if Moses would ever come down again, or if God would answer him at all. Days passed. The people avoided Aaron like a shadow. When he walked through camp, voices went quiet. Some blamed him out loud, some whispered. But one woman, a young mother with a baby on her hip, stopped and looked him in the eye. "My husband died in the judgment," she said coldly, "but the man who led us into it still breathes." Then she walked away. Aaron didn't sleep that night. On the fourth day, Miriam found him pacing outside the remains of the altar. "You haven't eaten," she said. He shook his head. "I can't." "God isn't done with you," she said softly. Aaron laughed, bitter. "He should be." Miriam stepped closer. "You think you're the first leader to fail? I built an idol." "You built a mistake," she said, "and now you get to decide what happens next." On the 40th day, Moses returned. His robes were torn, and his face, it glowed again. But this time, the glow was different. It was heavier, holier. When the people saw it, they fell back in fear. Moses called the elders. And Aaron stood at the edge, not sure if he was still allowed in the circle. But Moses saw him and nodded. Later, Moses approached him alone, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it slowly, a scroll of instructions for the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God and the high priest. Aaron stared at it. "What is this?" he asked. "It's from the Lord," Moses replied. "He still wants you." Aaron's voice cracked. "After what I did?" Moses nodded. "He has forgiven you." Aaron blinked. "But why?" "Because grace isn't about what we've earned," Moses said. "It's about who God is." But that grace came with a call, a heavier one. "You'll build the altar," Moses said. "You'll learn the offerings. You'll stand before God on behalf of the very people you led astray." Aaron swallowed. "And what if I fail again?" Moses placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then stay close to the one who never does." Aaron stared at the scroll long after Moses left. Each instruction, each thread of the priest's robe, each drop of anointing oil was precise, sacred, and terrifying. He had wanted to be liked. Now he was being called to be holy. That night, Aaron knelt in the dust and wept. Not with the shame of failure, but with the weight of being chosen again. Not because of who he was, but because of who God had decided he would become. The sun was barely rising when Aaron was called. A hush hung over the Israelite camp. No children playing, no clatter of morning work, only quiet anticipation. Today was the day. The tabernacle was complete. The anointing oil had been poured. The altar had been built. And now the first offering was to be made. And Aaron, flawed, forgiven Aaron, was to be the one to make it. He stood before his tent, robes folded neatly across his arms. They were like nothing he had ever worn, pure white linen undergarments, a robe of deep blue, an ephod woven with gold, scarlet, and purple threads. On his chest, the breastplate sparkled with 12 stones, one for each tribe, and on his head a turban, with a gold plate across the front, etched with sacred words, "Holy to the Lord." Moses approached quietly. He looked at Aaron not as a brother, but as a priest. "Are you ready?" he asked. Aaron hesitated. "What if I'm not?" Moses didn't smile, not quite, but his eyes softened. "It's not about you being ready," he said. "It's about him being faithful." The people gathered in silence. Tens of thousands of them, some who had danced around the golden calf, some who had lost loved ones in the judgment. All of them watching now, as the same man who led them into failure walked forward in priestly robes. Not because he deserved it, but because grace had made space for him to rise again. Aaron climbed the altar steps, each one careful, deliberate. In his hands, the first sacrifice, a bull for his own sin. Because the priest had to be made clean before he could stand for anyone else. He placed his hand on the bull's head, and in that moment, all his fear, his shame, his memories of failure, they rose in his throat like smoke. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he did as the Lord had commanded. The fire blazed high, the blood was sprinkled, the sacrifice was made. Then came the offering for the people, a ram, a lamb. a grain offering, a peace offering. Each one done with trembling hands, each one according to the law. Each one a sign that sin could be covered and that mercy still had the final word. And when all was finished, Moses and Aaron came out of the tabernacle. Aaron lifted his hands and blessed the people. A moment passed. Then fire came down from heaven. It roared across the altar, consuming the sacrifice in an instant. And the people fell to the ground, faces in the dirt, crying out in awe. God had accepted them, not because they were perfect, but because he was present. And in that fire, Aaron felt something he hadn't felt since Egypt: peace. Not the peace that comes from applause, but the peace that comes from obedience. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the fire had died down to glowing embers, Aaron sat with his sons beneath the stars. He didn't speak for a while. He just breathed, listened to the wind, watched the smoke curl toward the sky. Then he turned to his sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, and spoke softly. "Remember today," he said, "not because it was perfect, but because God still showed up." The boys nodded, and Aaron whispered to himself, "So will I." The celebration was still echoing across the valley. Songs drifted from tent to tent. Laughter bubbled around every fire pit. Children ran with garlands of woven reeds, and the smell of roasted meat lingered like incense in the air. It was a day of victory, of worship, of new beginnings. But in the holy place, something was burning that shouldn't have been. Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's oldest sons, stood near the entrance to the tabernacle. Their new priestly garments still carried the scent of fresh oil and cedar. But their hearts were restless, excited, and a little too bold. "I want to do it again," Nadab whispered, holding a small fire pan. "We should," Abihu said, grinning. "Just one more offering, just us. Father doesn't need to know." "It's all for God," Nadab reasoned, "isn't it?" "But not his way," murmured Eleazar, watching from a distance. "You know the rules." "They're just coals and incense," Abihu said, waving him off. "What could go wrong?" They lit the fire, filled the censers, stepped forward, and offered strange fire before the Lord. Fire that was not commanded, not holy, not set apart, just enthusiasm without obedience. And in an instant, fire shot out from the presence of the Lord. It didn't flicker, it struck. A single flash, a single heartbeat, and they were gone. Burned in their priestly robes, fallen before the altar they had dared to approach without fear. The shouting started immediately. People screamed. Eleazar and Ithamar rushed forward, but it was too late. All that remained were two lifeless forms, crumpled at the place where heaven met earth. And Aaron! Aaron stood still, his eyes locked on the smoke rising from the bodies of his sons. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't move. Moses came to him quickly, voice trembling. "This is what the Lord meant when he said, 'Among those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy.'" Aaron said nothing, not because he didn't feel, but because the weight of it was too much to speak. His heart had been pierced by the very fire he once called holy. The people waited to see what he would do. Would he throw off his robes? Would he abandon his post? Would he run? But Aaron did something they never expected. He stayed. He didn't leave the tabernacle. He didn't mourn like the others. He obeyed, because God had commanded it. The bodies of his sons were carried away outside the camp, and Aaron remained. not out of coldness, but because he finally understood something he had missed in the chaos of the calf, in the pressure of the people, in the pull of popularity. God's presence is not a performance. It is not to be manipulated, or reshaped, or handled carelessly. Later Moses spoke again. "You must not drink wine or strong drink when you go into the tent of meeting," he said, voice firm. "You must make a distinction between the holy and the common." Aaron nodded slowly. His face was stone, but his spirit was learning to tremble. That night he sat alone near the altar, watching the flames flicker low. He thought of Nadab's laughter, of Abihu's voice, of their joy and their recklessness, and he whispered into the night, "Obedience, even when it hurts." Aaron didn't sleep for 3 nights. He lit the altar fires every morning, taught sacrifices by the scroll, answered the people's questions with a steady voice. But in his heart, only silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of a soul scorched by grief. One morning, as the sun spilled orange across the horizon, Aaron stood alone inside the tabernacle's courtyard, adjusting the golden lampstand. His hands were precise, his eyes were hollow. Eleazar approached quietly, hesitant. "Abba?" he said. Aaron didn't turn. "I don't know what to say," Eleazar whispered. "They were my brothers." "They were priests," Aaron said, voice low. "And they forgot who they were standing in front of." He finally turned, looking Eleazar straight in the eye. "You won't." That afternoon, something strange happened. A group of tribal leaders, dignified men with ornate robes and polished staffs, gathered outside the tabernacle. They weren't there to worship. They were there to challenge. Korach, a cousin of Moses, and Aaron stepped forward first. "I've watched you since Egypt," he said, "and I've followed all your rules, but now I must ask, who made you the holy ones?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Aaron stiffened. "This priesthood, this tabernacle, this spotlight, it belongs to all the people, not just your family," Korach continued. "You think I wanted this?" Aaron said. "I built an idol. I buried my sons. Do you think this robe is a reward?" Korach raised an eyebrow. "Number. But I think you're holding on to power like it is." That night, Aaron sat by the fire, disturbed. He didn't fear Korach's words, but he feared what they revealed. There were still those who wanted the fire without the fear. Still those who believed leadership was about visibility, not responsibility. He looked at the stars and whispered, "Lord, what do I do when obedience makes me the enemy?" But there was no answer, just the wind. The next day, God spoke, and the answer was fire. But not Aaron's this time. God opened the earth beneath Korach and his followers and swallowed their rebellion whole. The ground closed as if it had never split. A warning carved into creation. And yet, the people still grumbled. "Too harsh," they said. "Too much. Too fast." Aaron was stunned. He had wept. He had fasted. He had obeyed. And still, they questioned everything. That night he fell to his knees inside the holy place. "Lord, I don't know how to lead them," he whispered. "They don't trust me. And sometimes I don't trust me either." And God answered, not with thunder, not with fire, but with a test. The Lord told Moses, "Have every tribe bring a staff. Write the name of each tribal leader on it, and write Aaron's name on the staff of Levi. Lay them before me overnight. I will show the people who I have chosen." The next morning, 12 staffs lay in the tabernacle. 11 were dry, plain, dead. But Aaron's staff had bloomed, almond blossoms, fragrant, bright, alive. From a dead stick came beauty. From obedience came confirmation. The people gasped, they fell on their faces. And Aaron, he didn't smile, he didn't boast. He just held the staff and wept, because now he knew he had been chosen not to be praised, but to carry the weight. Later, he placed the staff inside the Ark of the Covenant as a reminder, not just to Israel, but to himself. Leadership was not about applause, it was about alignment with the one who made dead wood bloom. The desert had turned cruel again. The sun beat down like judgment. The winds blew hot and dry, scratching the throats of every man, woman, and child in Israel. And worst of all, there was no water, not a drop. The camp twisted with tension. Cattle collapsed from thirst. Children whimpered in their mother's arms. Dust coated every mouth, and the complaints came quickly. "Have you brought us here to die again? No wells, no streams, only more promises. If the Lord is with us, where's the water?" Aaron stood beside Moses, silent, watching the crowd like a storm cloud waiting to burst. He'd heard these complaints before, seen this pattern before, but this time, something in him ached, not with fear, with frustration. Inside the tent of meeting, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces. God answered, "Take the staff, assemble the people, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." It was clear, simple, precise. Speak, not strike. But when Aaron walked out of the tent and saw the people waiting, shouting, jeering, something shifted inside him. All he could see were their bitter faces. All he could hear were their ungrateful words. He had wept for them, sacrificed for them, buried his sons for them, and still they doubted. Still they accused. Still they pushed. Moses lifted the staff and shouted, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Aaron didn't stop him, didn't pause, didn't speak. The staff rose, cracked against the stone, once, twice, and water gushed out in torrents. The people cheered, they drank, they praised. And no one, not one of them, noticed the subtle crack that had just formed. Later, in the silence of the tabernacle, God spoke again. But this time, it wasn't a command. It was a consequence. "You did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the people." Aaron's breath caught. "I obeyed," he said softly. God's voice was steady, final. "You struck. I said speak." Moses stood frozen beside him, both of them leaders, both of them faithful, both of them flawed. "You will not enter the promised land," the Lord said. Not a shout, not a punishment fueled by wrath, but a quiet, holy sorrow, the kind that breaks the heart more than thunder ever could. Aaron stepped out into the night, the stars above cold and bright. He looked out across the wilderness, the same wilderness he had walked for years. He thought of Egypt, of the calf, of Nadab and Abihu, of Korach, of Eleazar, and now of a rock, struck when it should have been spoken to. "I was angry," he whispered. But anger hadn't been his permission. Obedience was. And he had let it slip, not in a storm of sin, but in the slow drift of pride. He felt the staff in his hand, the same one that bloomed with almonds, and now it felt heavier than ever before. Not because it was made of wood, but because it carried everything. The sun was setting when the command came. A soft golden light spread across the wilderness, painting the rocks with fire and shadow. The wind was gentle, still, like it knew what was coming. Moses stood at the entrance of the tabernacle, holding the word of the Lord in his hand. He didn't need to read it aloud. Aaron already knew. "You are to climb Mount Hor," Moses said quietly, in front of the people. Aaron didn't speak. "Take Eleazar with you," Moses added, "and your priestly garments." Still, Aaron said nothing, because there was nothing left to argue. That evening, as the people gathered, Aaron moved slowly through the camp. Not in shame, but with solemnity. He greeted old friends, blessed small children, laid a hand on the heads of those who had once cursed him, and smiled anyway. And at the edge of the camp, Miriam's memory lingered, her laughter caught in the wind like a forgotten song. Eleazar waited by the mountain's base, dressed in plain linen. No jewels, no gold, just a quiet, steady gaze. "You ready?" he asked softly. Aaron looked at him, his son, his successor. "No," he replied, "but I'm willing." The climb was slow. 3 figures, 1 mountain. Every step a memory, every breath a prayer. Moses remembered the Red Sea. Aaron remembered the golden calf. Eleazar remembered watching his brothers burn for offering fire without permission. And now he was next. At the summit, the wind picked up. The sky had turned lavender and deep orange, and the stars were blinking awake. Aaron turned to Moses. "I didn't want the priesthood," he said. "I know," Moses answered. "I didn't earn it." "You didn't have to. I failed." "You were faithful." Aaron looked at Eleazar. "Do you think he'll do better than me?" "No," Moses said, "but he'll do it differently." Aaron smiled. That was enough. He removed the breastplate first, 1 stone at a time, each gem representing a tribe, a people, a burden, then the ephod, then the sash, until he stood in his linen undergarments, nothing but a man again, a man who had stood in fire and failure, a man who had been forgiven much. He placed the garments on Eleazar, one by one, and with each piece, a transfer of calling, of responsibility, of weight. Eleazar didn't speak. He just bowed his head. And when Aaron placed the gold plate on his forehead, holy to the Lord, he felt his hands shake, not from fear, from reverence. Aaron lay down on a stone bench near the peak. The wind calmed. The stars leaned in. And his last words were not of regret. They were a whisper. "Don't lead them to applause, my son. Lead them to obedience." Then he closed his eyes, and the Lord took him home. Moses and Eleazar came down the mountain without him. The people wept for 30 days, not just because Aaron had died, but because they realized too late. They had followed a man who had spent his life standing between them and God, even when they didn't deserve it. That night, Eleazar lit the altar fire, and as the smoke rose into the sky, he prayed the same words his father had once prayed. Let me fear you more than them. Let me serve you even when I'm not strong, and let me never forget. Obedience is greater than applause. Aaron was gone, but his voice hadn't left. It lingered in the cracks of the tabernacle walls, in the ashes of the altar. In the quiet way, Eleazar rolled the priestly sash. And in the minds of a people still wandering, still wondering, still wrestling with obedience. The camp had grown quieter since Mount Hor, not reverent, restless. The promised land was near enough to smell, but fear still hung on the edges of their hearts like desert dust. Eleazar stood at the altar with firm hands but uncertain eyes. His father had been steady, even in failure. Now Eleazar was wearing his robes, saying his prayers, carrying the weight of a people not yet ready to be led. And one morning, that weight pressed harder. A man named Zimri stormed into the outer court, proud, arrogant, defiant. With him, a Midianite woman dressed in glittering silks. They strolled hand in hand, laughing, straight past the Levites, right into the center of the camp, right past the altar. Eleazar stood frozen. Moses rose in disbelief. And the people? They did nothing, just stared. Zimri wasn't the only one crossing lines anymore. Others had joined him, quietly, secretly. He was just the first to do it out loud. That night, the plague began. It swept through the camp like wind through dry grass, tens, then hundreds, then thousands, all because the people once again chose pleasure over obedience. And no one had stopped them. Eleazar stood outside the tabernacle, fists clenched. "I'm not him," he muttered. "I'm not Aaron." But a young Levite named Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, did what no one expected. He rose, he grabbed a spear, and without asking permission, without holding a council, without waiting for consensus, he obeyed the holiness of God. Zimri and the woman were struck down. The camp gasped. The plague stopped, and heaven took notice. That night, the Lord spoke, not to Moses, not to Eleazar, but to the whole camp. Because Phinehas was zealous with my zeal, I have turned back my wrath. His line will be blessed. Eleazar watched Phinehas from afar, young, imperfect, but brave and obedient. And for the first time in days, Eleazar smiled, because he saw something more powerful than robes and titles. He saw someone willing to stand alone for the right thing, just like Aaron should have done at the calf, just like Moses did before Pharaoh, just like he was now called to do. The next morning, Eleazar cleaned the altar stones himself. He whispered the same prayer his father once had. "Not my voice, Lord, yours. Not my way, yours." And as the smoke rose, he looked to the horizon, where the land of promise shimmered beyond the Jordan. And though Aaron would never step into it, his legacy had. The wind changed as they neared the Jordan. It was different now, cooler, cleaner, touched by promise. On the far side of the river, hills rolled like green waves, palms danced in the breeze, flocks grazed on soft hillsides. This was the land their parents had dreamed of, the land Aaron had longed for, and the land he would never see. At the front of the procession, Eleazar walked with Moses. His father's staff was in his hand, not Aaron's exact staff. The almond branch that bloomed had been placed inside the ark years ago, but another, carved from the same tree, balanced, weighty, sacred. "Before we cross," Moses said quietly, There's one thing we must do. Eleazar already knew. They turned back for a moment, not to the camp, but to a cave carved high into Mount Hor, the place where Aaron had taken his final breath. It had been months since his passing, but his memory still lived like a breath in the tent walls, like a shadow at the altar. Now, they would carry his bones home. Eleazar stepped into the cave with quiet steps, laid the linen wrap gently over the remains, held the breastplate one more time, just for a moment. The stones still sparkled. 12 tribes, 12 burdens, 12 reminders that a priest never walks alone. Outside the cave, a group of young men waited. Levites born in the wilderness, raised on stories of the man who had once stood between wrath and mercy. They lowered their heads as Eleazar passed by. They didn't cheer. They didn't sing. They remembered. That night, a ceremony was held near the Jordan banks. A fire was lit. Scrolls were read. And for the first time in years, the people didn't argue or complain. They listened. Moses stood before them, aged and bright-eyed, voice strong as ever. He recounted the journey, how God had led them, fed them, judged them, loved them. And then he spoke of Aaron. "My brother was not perfect," Moses said, "but he was chosen. He stood for you," he continued, "in your sin, in your doubt, in your rebellion. He bore your names on his chest. He wept for you at the altar. He lifted his hands when yours were too weak. He failed, but he never fled." And then Moses paused, looked out at the new generation, the children of the ones who had built the calf, grumbled over manna, feared the giants. "He was a leader," Moses said, "who learned the hard way that pleasing people can lead to destruction. But he also learned that God restores and uses those who repent." A hush fell over the crowd, and Eleazar stepped forward, lifted the staff, and said only this: "Obedience is the only safe path through the wilderness." They buried Aaron's bones in the valley of Moab near a grove of trees, not for him, but for them. A boundary stone for their memory, a reminder to every foot that crossed into the land: do not lead for applause, do not compromise for comfort, do not forget who brought you here. The Jordan was swollen, wild with spring rain. It rushed fast and loud, a wall of water that shimmered in the sunlight and dared the people to cross. On the far side, Jericho, palm trees, promise. But here, on the banks, uncertainty. The generation that stood trembling now was not the one who had danced around the calf. These were their sons, their daughters, raised on desert dust, fed by manna, taught to fear the Lord, not Pharaoh. But even they needed reminding, because even a new generation can repeat old mistakes. Eleazar stood behind the Ark of the Covenant, the gold still gleaming. On either side of him, priests waited with tense hands. The command was simple: step into the river. But simple didn't mean easy. Joshua, the new leader, gave the signal, and the moment their feet touched the water, it stopped. Upstream, the flood piled like a wall. Downstream, the river drained into silence, and the priests stood in the middle of dry ground. One by one, the tribes crossed. Judah, Reuben, Gad. Children stared in awe. Fathers wept. Mothers whispered prayers passed down from Sinai. And all the while, Eleazar stood steady, Aaron's name carved in memory across his heart. But as the last tribe crossed, a man near the back of the line paused. He looked back across the river, toward the wilderness. "Why did Aaron have to die out there?" he asked quietly. An old woman beside him replied, "Because he listened to the people once, when he should have listened to God." When all had crossed, Joshua gave another command. 12 stones were gathered from the middle of the riverbed, one for each tribe, and placed in a circle on the far bank. A monument, not to crossing, but to obedience. "Why here?" a young boy asked. Joshua knelt beside him. "Because someday you'll forget." "Forget what?" "That we got here by God's hand," Joshua said. "Not our strength, not our cleverness, and not because we followed crowds." The boy looked at the river. "And what about Aaron?" he asked. "Wasn't he a priest?" Joshua looked at Eleazar, who was just stepping out of the river. "He was," he said, "and he taught us all that obedience matters more than leadership." That night, as the stars lit up the sky and the camp settled into the promised land for the first time, Eleazar sat alone by the stones. In his hand was the staff. He ran his fingers along the grooves, the weight still familiar. And then he spoke, not to the people, but to the air, to memory, to legacy, to the man who walked between fire and failure, he whispered, to the priest who stood when others bowed, to my father who taught us that compromise costs more than conflict. The wind blew gently, as if the wilderness itself exhaled. Aaron was gone. But the story wasn't over, because obedience doesn't end at the river. It begins there. Jericho stood tall and unmoved. Its walls were thick, its gates shut tight, its people alert. From a distance, it looked invincible, like a challenge daring them to try. And the people of Israel? They were ready, or so they thought. Eleazar stood beside Joshua on a ridge overlooking the city. Behind them, warriors checked their weapons. Young men stretched, paced, prayed. The air buzzed with tension and expectation. This was the moment they had trained for. "What's the plan?" Eleazar asked. Joshua didn't answer right away. He was staring into the distance, brows furrowed. Then he spoke. "We march." Eleazar blinked. "That's it?" "We march," Joshua repeated. "Once around the city each day for 6 days, then 7 times on the 7th day, and we don't say a word." Eleazar looked at him. "We're just walking?" Joshua nodded. "Until God says otherwise." The next morning, the priests led the way. Ark out front, horns in hand. Eleazar walked beside them, no swords drawn, no shouting, no speeches, just footsteps in silence, dust rising under sandals. He could hear the mocking from Jericho's walls, laughter, insults. A watermelon splattered near the back of the line. Still no one spoke. On the second day, the tension grew. "We're soldiers, not dancers," one man muttered. "This isn't war. This is waiting." "Why are we letting priests lead this fight?" Eleazar heard them. He said nothing. But deep inside, he felt it too. The pressure. The old itch to appease, to take control, to strike the rock instead of speaking to it. But he remembered Aaron. He remembered the calf, and Nadab, and Abihu, and the fire that had fallen. He gripped the staff tighter. No shortcuts, no substitutions, no compromise. By the sixth day, even the ground seemed impatient. The dust kicked up faster, the footsteps louder, the men's stares sharper, but still no command to attack. Then came day 7. They rose before dawn, marched once, twice, 5 times, 6. By the 7th time around Jericho, sweat soaked every robe, muscles ached, tempers simmered. Some gritted their teeth, others shook their heads, and then Joshua raised his hand. The trumpets blew, and the silence shattered. "Shout!" Joshua commanded, "for the Lord has given you the city." The sound erupted, thousands of voices at once, and the walls cracked, not from hammers, not from human strength, from obedience, from faith, from the kind of surrender that looks like weakness but wins like nothing else. Eliezer stood frozen as the stones fell. Jericho was conquered, not by force, but by following. And the lesson struck him hard. You don't have to be loud to lead. You just have to listen. That night, fires burned in the cleared city. People rejoiced. Songs rang out. But Eleazar sat quietly near the edge of the camp, gazing up at the stars. He remembered his father's words. Don't lead them to applause, lead them to obedience. And in the hush between the embers, Eleazar whispered, Aaron, we're still listening. The land was quiet now. The battles had been fought. Jericho was dust. Ai had fallen. The sun had stood still over Gibeon, and Israel was beginning to settle. Tents were being replaced with homes, altars with harvest fields. Manna had stopped falling from heaven, because now the land itself was feeding them. But even in the stillness, Eleazar knew the most dangerous days weren't behind them. They were ahead. Because peace has a way of making people forget. One evening, Eleazar stood on a hill overlooking the valley of Shiloh where the tabernacle now stood, its curtains swaying in the breeze. He held Aaron's staff in one hand, and in the other, a smooth, almond-shaped stone. A reminder. Behind him, children ran in the grass, playing. Some of them were sons of priests, others, sons of warriors. All of them, sons of promise. And one day, they would be leaders too. So that night, Eleazar gathered them near the altar. He sat on a stone, let the fire crackle low, and told them the whole story. Not the cleaned-up version, the real one. He told them about Egypt, about the plagues, about the day Aaron spoke for Moses and trembled in Pharaoh's court. He told them about the calf, how fear can look like faith when it's desperate. He told them about the fire that took Nadab and Abihu, not because God was cruel, but because he is holy. He told them how Aaron stood in the gap during a plague, running through the camp with a censer in his hand, stopping death with intercession. And he told them about the mountain, how Aaron had to take off his robe before he could enter glory. The children sat wide-eyed, silent, listening, until one boy raised his hand. Was Aaron a hero? Eleazar smiled gently. No, he said. He was a priest. But he made mistakes, another whispered. Yes, Eleazar said, but he obeyed again after he failed, and that's what made him great. Then he picked up the almond staff, held it high. This, he said, bloomed in the desert. Why? A girl asked. Because God doesn't choose leaders for their popularity, Eleazar said. He chooses them for their obedience. And the children nodded, not because they understood everything, but because they felt it, like truth settling into the soil of their souls. Years later, when Eleazar's time was done, they laid him beside his father near Mount Ephraim, and the staff was passed down again, a symbol not of perfection, but of the weight of listening. Aaron was remembered, not as a man who never fell, but as a man who, even after falling, stood up again and walked, trembling, repentant, faithful, into the presence of God. And his story whispered on, don't lead for praise. Don't follow fear. Don't trade holiness for approval, and never forget. Obedience is the only safe way to walk with God. Approval, and never forget. Obedience is the only safe way to walk with God.